I would not be surprised to see Trump drop Vance and replace him. I don't think it'll happen this week. I think as the election goes along, if after the debate, Trump does not feel like things are going in his favor, I could see the temptation coming up much more in late September or even early October. Whether it helps or hurts, of course, really depends on who he picks. Haley did have an ability to reach out to swing voters in a way that Trump simply does not. And as we've seen, Vance's poll numbers as a running mate are much lower than is normally the case. Usually a running mate gets named, and then except for their own debate with their opponent, they don't get really much attention for the rest of the campaign. But Vance, because he's had a history of somewhat provocative statements, he has remained more in the public and media focus, and his poll numbers are somewhat lower than we normally see in vice presidential nominees. So yeah, I think you're right, Roger. If Trump felt that he was losing the election and his alternative were to blame himself or to blame someone else, I think it's very plausible that he would decide it's all JD Vance's fault and he needed to be replaced with someone else. Whether you could do Haley or not, that would be quite a leap. But
really?
if he felt like he was losing, it's a really intriguing possibility. I'll say this: I think the possibility of Vance not being the nominee is greater than the possibility of Haley taking his place. But I wouldn't write off either one.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Roger. And I believe the next hand I saw go up was Carol. Carol, I believe you're still.
I've been kind of wondering about AOC's presentation at the convention. Obviously, she'll appeal to progressives, and she won't appeal to middle of the road crossover voters. I think it may help to humanize her. But Dan, what's your opinion about her being on the roster?
I think it's an important thing for the convention to do because she has is so popular among progressive voters, particularly among young people. As I mentioned during the webinar, Harris doesn't face the same kind of challenge with those constituencies that Biden did. Biden really, really needed Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren out on the stump for them. Harris benefits from it, but not to the same degree. So I think having Ocasio-Cortez talk to the convention, but early in the week, is a good way of squaring that circle. A more casual viewer who's more likely to tune in as the week goes on might not notice, but her most ardent supporters are going to watch and they're going to share video clips. And so I think a Monday speaking time was the right decision for them with her.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right. I don't see any other questions in the chat just yet or any hands up. Does anybody have any questions?
I have one I can ask, but I don't want to jump ahead of anybody else.
No, you're good. Come on.
Okay. So Dan, I was thinking about what you said earlier, and I wondered if Waltz at the convention has a role to dish back stuff to Trump, as we've seen him do previously, in the last couple of speeches. What do you think about that?
I think that's really interesting. Running mates historically, in a pre-Trump era, were tasked with taking the low road against their opponents. For those of you who've come to these before, you've heard me talk before about backlash. When a candidate goes negative on their opponent, two things happen. One, we know that a negative message is more likely to resonate with voters than a positive message. So we know that a negative message leaves a mark. But we also know that backlash means that most voters don't like the person who delivers a negative message. So one of the ways they've always distanced themselves from that is to have their running mates do it. Trump is happy to do that for himself, so that's a less necessary role for his running mate. But I think you might be onto something here, Melissa, which is reverting to a historical norm would be Harris taking a largely, not entirely, but a primarily positive role, and Waltz being more critical of Trump. And in addition to his ability to reach those rural and small town voters, like we talked about earlier, one of the other things that reportedly attracted the Harris team to Waltz is his ability to criticize Trump, and even very harshly, without sounding all that mean.
Mhm.
That regular guy, coach next door thing seems to protect him from at least a little bit of the backlash. So
Yeah,
I think you might be onto something here.
wondering. He's a great speaker, Dan. I enjoyed listening to him.
I found this out. This is absolutely irrelevant to his political potential. But one of my roommates at my first college played high school football at the same high school where Tim Waltz coached. Now, granted, because Tim Waltz and I are about the same age, my friend played there long before Waltz did, but I'd known about Mankato High School long before the last couple of weeks. So not relevant to anything, but I couldn't resist.
Thank you. Love it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Melissa and Dan. And we have a hand up. Rick, if you'd love to unmute and ask your question, go for it.
Thank you. Dan, you've talked a lot about how over the last 30 years, the percentage of voters that are kind of undecided and in the middle has declined, with the polarization increasing. And to what extent do you think, and we've talked about, the competing things that parties have to do. They have to motivate their own base, but they also have to try to persuade swing voters. How do you think, or to what extent do you think that dynamic has changed because of the decline in uncommitted voters? And how does that relate to what you think the Democrats, and for that matter, the Republicans, need to try to do in this election in terms of reaching out? And kind of a micro question in there, do you think it might vary from state to state depending on the demographics of a particular state? Thanks.
So I'll answer the second half first because it's easier. It definitely varies from state to state, because the larger your base is in a particular state, the less you need to reach beyond that base. So California Democrats don't need to reach a lot of swing voters, whereas Arizona Democrats do. So the dynamic does change on a state by state basis. And so for these 7 swing states, Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin in the north, Georgia and North Carolina and Arizona and Nevada in the south, in these 7 states, the ability to persuade undecided voters becomes much, much more important than in the rest of the country. But your question is a really interesting one, Rick. It basically, you put a finger on the biggest change in political strategy in the years since I stopped doing campaigns. When I came up a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, we learned, smart political operatives in both parties learned what was called the 80-20 rule. The idea is you spend 80% of your time and 80% of your money talking to the middle 20% of the electorate, because that middle 20, those undecideds, were ultimately the difference between winning and losing. And for most of the 21st century, we've seen first a gradual and then a more accelerated move away from that 80-20 approach. Trump didn't invent the change, but he did accelerate it, where every 4 years we now see candidates spending less time talking to those swing voters and more time trying to motivate their base. Part of that's because, as you correctly pointed out, about how polarized politics has become. Part of it's because of the changes in communications technology. If I were watching the TV news back in the day with Maddie's grandparents, we might have different political opinions, but we'd watch the same newscaster and we'd watch the same commercials and therefore drink the same information. Today, one of us is watching MSNBC, the other one's watching Fox. We listen to our own podcasts, we go to our favorite websites. And so it's harder to reach those swing voters because those swing voters now can avoid the political conversation to a much greater extent than they could back in the days of the 80-20 theory. So for both political, I'd say political, cultural, and technological reasons, motivating the base has become a much greater priority for campaigns than in my day. But ultimately, in the conclusion to your question, I think admirably pointed this out, that while campaigns mostly can rely more and more on base motivation, in that small number of swing states in the closing weeks of a campaign, you still got to reach out to the center. So the
Thank you.
short answer to your question, yes and no.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. Do we have any other questions? Anybody wants to come on screen?
This is unprecedented, people.
Yeah. Oh, I see. Okay.
Roger and Anita come to the rescue.
Oh, Roger, you are still muted. Let's unmute you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm pretty far away from you, so I'll answer my questions from South Carolina here. What about the swift boating type of thing that's going on with the walls? You think that's going to have much of an effect?
I don't. I think in very, very rare, except in very, very rare circumstances, and Sarah Palin and Thomas Eagleton are the only two that come to mind, voters just don't pay a lot of attention to running mates. And if a campaign knows that it has a limited window of opportunity through which to talk to voters, it makes a lot more sense to talk about the candidates than about the vice presidential nominees. So I'm guessing that Republicans reacted that way just sort of reflexively, because for a day or two or three, that's what's being discussed. But I would be surprised. I think they're more politically savvy than to spend a lot of time and a lot of firepower on it going forward, particularly with a nominee who didn't serve himself.
Okay. Comforting.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Roger. And then Anita, if you want to ask your second question.
Okay, so this is totally off base. However, you mentioned a galaxy far, far away. So I wanted to know if you have the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything.
Do I have the ultimate answer to the universe?
To life, the universe, and everything.
I do, but we just don't have nearly enough time on this webinar to go through it. I'm going to have to set up a special session for that.
No, it's one word answer. Okay, so you haven't read the Hitchhiker's Guide.
Actually, so are you talking about why the universe exists, or what the most important aspects of it, or the most important
No.
aspects of it?
No, well, I'll email you the answer. Unless you want me to tell you here.
Please do. I think we're all curious.
It's 42.
42 is
you
the
have to
secret
read
of the
the book.
universe.
Jackie Robinson?
I have read the
No,
book.
it's who's the guy who wrote
Hitchhiker's Guide.
Douglas Adams.
Oh, it's
Hitchhiker's
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe.
Go back and reread it. It's so much fun.
All right, I'm on it. Peter Graves, hey, look at that, Maddie. Peter's sending us a question.
Oh, okay. All right. I
How
see.
effective are postcard campaigns? And the answer is they're much more effective than people in the 21st century would think. Because a postcard or mail, when it shows up in your house, it tends to stick around. It's really easy for me to delete an email. It's really easy for me to ignore a text. But when there's a piece of paper sitting on the hall table or the kitchen counter or on the desk in my office, that sticks around all the way until election day. And it doesn't guarantee that I'll look at it, but the fact that it still physically exists, and if you'll excuse me for saying so, Anita, if that still exists in my universe, the fact that it physically, tangibly is there gives it staying power that digital messaging does not have. So it's not done as much as it used to be, and the news media doesn't write much about it, but smart campaigns still tend to rely very heavily on direct mail, on postcards and other types of USPS messaging.
That's good to hear, because I've sent about 100 postcards through a group I'm associated with to North Carolina. So we'll see what happens.
They're very effective. That's a smart way for you to be spending.
Nebraska.
And I would argue that's a smarter way to spend your time, Peter, than sending texts.
Good to know for me. Gotta start sending some postcards. All right.
Mm.
I believe Sid, we've got a hand up here. If you want to come on, Sid.
It's handy.
Oh, give me just 1 second to unmute you. I think you might have to unmute. Yeah.
I think you're gonna have to do it. There we go.
I think you can hear me now.
Sure can.
Okay. My question is related to more about the Democratic platform and the direction it's going. 4 years ago, Bernie Sanders was very influential and put forth a number of what people would consider to be radical, maybe even socialist or communist policies. I don't hear too much about him now. I didn't even see him on your list of featured speakers earlier. What happened to his influence in the party, and why has it disappeared?
Well, it's a really smart question. And in fact, Sid, it hasn't disappeared, but for the reasons we were talking about earlier, Harris needs Sanders less than Biden does. Biden, as you know, we've talked about it before, Biden has really struggled to motivate the party base, not just this year, but even back in 2020, that wasn't really his thing. And so Biden spent a lot of time working with and talking with Sanders, even back in 2020. Remember, Sanders was very upset because a lot of people accused him of not campaigning as aggressively as he could have for Clinton 4 years earlier. Biden didn't want to suffer the same fate that Clinton did with progressives staying home. So he really put in the time on Sanders, and Sanders didn't want to get blamed again. So they developed a pretty strong working relationship. And in the early stages of this campaign, Sanders was a very vocal surrogate for Biden on television, on the stump in key states, and so on. He'll have a featured speaking role at the convention this week. And I should have mentioned him, but did not. But it won't be as important a role simply because Harris has been able to motivate Democratic progressives in a way that Biden couldn't. To me, what's interesting about Sanders is while Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is obviously very progressive and very popular, what neither Sanders nor Warren have done is, while they have cultivated an issue agenda and developed a very strong populist following, neither one has devoted a great deal to building the next generation of progressive leaders underneath them. And again, that's not to minimize the role that Ocasio-Cortez plays, but she's not who she is because of Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. That's something she's done on her own. And I think Sanders, at some point in the not too distant future, will look back at his history in the Democratic Party, and he will be, I think he'll be justifiably able to point to a great deal that he accomplished. The question is how that continues once he has left the stage. But you're right, Sid, I should have mentioned him earlier, but in a Kamala Harris party, the need for him isn't as urgent as it is under Biden.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you. And then Rick, if you'd like to unmute.
Yeah, Dan, I have a kind of a follow-up in a way to the earlier question that I asked, and that is, I know one of the other things you've always talked about, and as an experienced, worker in campaigns, the idea of having a kind of a very refined and kind of singular message, not trying to address too many issues at once. Do you think that's changed now with the demographic we've talked about, how there are fewer voters in the middle? Or do you think that it's still somewhat important? And I know I've sometimes gotten frustrated with campaigns when it seems to me that they're not addressing issues that at least I consider to be important, and that I think other people consider to be important, because they're focusing too much on a single issue. What do you think the balance is now in this campaign, and how would you advise the Harris campaign to address that issue, and maybe the Trump campaign too, if you have an opinion about that?
Okay. So for as long as I worked in politics, we learned that a candidate should concentrate on a small number of issues. Because for a voter who's only casually paying attention, if they hear a message on a relatively small number of issues, they're more likely to retain it. Whereas if you, Rick, are talking about 7, 8, 10 different issues, that more casual, low information voter is thinking, Curcio, is he the healthcare guy? No. He's talking about immigration. Oh, he's talking about climate change. I don't remember. Whereas the smaller number of issues, makes it more clear and more memorable. What I would always tell my candidates, though, is I'd say you only talk about 3 issues proactively. You need to be prepared to answer questions on any issue. And we also talk about how to shift the conversation from one of the issues we'd rather not be talking about to one of the ones we want to. But back to the frustration that you talked about, I would never want a candidate who I was advising not to be able to answer you fully and completely on an issue that was important to you. We just wouldn't emphasize that issue as much when you weren't asking about it. What's changed in a digital era, I think, is not the number of issues, but a couple things have changed. One, the attention span of the voters is even shorter. And we're all guilty of this. We tend to blame it to the Gen Zers, but we all have shorter attention spans than we did 20 years ago because we've learned to read online and we've learned to check texts and emails, even if we're reading something longer. And it's just the way the world has changed. Even if you watch a movie from the late 20th century, what you'll notice is how much longer the cuts are and the scenes are. We just had more patience then, and now those cuts come much more and are edited much more quickly. So one thing that's changed is our attention span. But rather than the candidates, for the most part, talking about fewer issues, what this technology allows them to do is to target their message more precisely. So in other words, rather than running a TV ad that everyone in the greater Los Angeles area sees, I can send different emails or put up different ads on your server based on your demographic characteristics, your consumer habits, your income, your issue preferences. So even you and your next door neighbor are hearing me talk to you about only three issues, but I could be talking to you about 3 entirely different issues than your next door neighbor, or talking to you about those issues in a different way. So I think that the biggest change is how much more precise the targeting has become. And if you think about it, this exists in consumer product also. When you go online and you see ads for shoes or for movies or for vacation cruises, you're seeing those ads because the algorithm has decided based on your online habits that these are things of particular interest to you. And candidates can now do the same thing, marketing to you based not on what they think is important, but based on what you think is important, because they know that they're much more likely to get you to respond.
Just as a quick follow-up, are the campaigns actively doing that kind of thing, or is that just something they're sort of talking about? I mean,
no.
And I'm not on all kinds of other social media platforms, so I don't see some of this stuff. But
I will tell you, it's not. They are doing it, and you are being impacted by it. If you use the internet and go to websites, political or otherwise, there's a record of that. When you turn on the TV and watch a program on Netflix or on Amazon instead of on broadcast, there's not only a record of that show, Netflix knows how long you watched it for and how quickly you turned it off. And every time, even out in the real brick and mortar world, Rick, every time you use a credit card for a purchase, that information is sold not just to soft drink and sneaker manufacturers, it's sold to political campaigns too. And they're really smart politicos who know that if you drink a certain type of beer and drive a certain type of car, you're that much more likely to vote for one party than the other.
Thank you.
So on one hand, they're talking about the things that are important to you. On the other hand, it's a little bit creepy, isn't it?
Well, yeah, but this whole world has that aspect that it's exciting and yet creepy at the same time.
Okay, if you want to read more on that, I'll recommend Jonathan Haidt, Haidt. He's a sociologist at New York University who's written a great deal about the impact of social media on society. And Anita, I'll read Douglas Adams if you read Jonathan Haidt.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, everybody. I know you hear me say this every month, but I really do mean it. As much as I enjoy the webinar, I love these sessions even more. So thank you very much for joining. And I'll look forward to seeing you again in a few weeks, and we will dissect the Harris-Trump debate. How much fun is that going to be? All right, we'll see you then. Maddie,
Thanks
thanks
very
as
much.
always for all your help. We'll see all of you guys soon.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank
Good
you.
man, Dan.
Great as always.
Bye. Dan, you have a much better read than I am, I promise you.
It's a deal.